Hello and welcome to Creating Disciples with me, Austin Roberts. I am excited to have you with us today as we are going to be taking a look at a text in a book that we probably don't often look at. Although this text is well known, likely to you as it is to me, the book as a whole is not one we often delve into from the pulpit. So we're going to be looking at a text in the Book of Micah, and we're going to be talking about expectations and realities. So, once again, thank you for joining us, and we hope the Lord blesses you today. I don't know about you, but in my life, there are expectations. I suppose that's true for many people as we go in school and work and our personal lives. There are always expectations somewhere. You've got to complete these tasks. You've got to do these things. You've got to complete these items. There are expectations for us no matter where we go. I remember quite a number of years ago now when I was in high school. There always seemed to be a lot of expectations in high school. I remember, of course, there was an expectation to get good grades. Then there was an expectation to take part in extracurricular activities, clubs, sports teams, a variety of different things. Then there was an expectation to also have a social life, keep up with good friends, have a good time. Then there was an expectation to do chores around the house, complete all these different things around the home as being part of the family. And there seemed to just be expectations all the time, everywhere, no matter what I did. Expectations. And from time to time, it got frustrating. I remember thinking every once in a while, to my parents in particular, what else do you want from me? I'm doing the best that I can. So many expectations. How do you expect me to do all of this? Expectations everywhere. Well, for a kid who's in his mid to late teen years, that seems like a lot to handle, but it doesn't really compare to some of the expectations that my wife has to live up to. You see, a little over a year ago, she started in her OBGYN residency program here at the Loma Linda University Medical Center. Now, it's hard to really describe the type of situations that she finds herself in on a daily basis. Many of these situations can be life-altering, particularly to her patients. She's got to make important decisions. She's got to do things quickly. She's got to keep things moving. And on top of all that, the hours that she puts into work are exceedingly long. No matter where she goes, no matter what she does, no matter how she does, she always has high expectations she is required to meet. Expectations are a big deal. Everywhere we go in life, it feels like, it seems like there are always expectations to which we must live up. That is the reality of living life on this earth. That is the reality of being in a relationship with somebody, or having friendships, having parents, kids, spouses, brothers, sisters, co-workers, fellow students, colleagues. Expectations surround us every step of the way throughout our lives, it seems. Well, recently, within the last couple of months here, I went, along with a cousin-in-law and his girlfriend and some other friends, to the training camp of the Dallas Cowboys. Now, I'm a big Dallas Cowboys fan. They're a team that plays in the National Football League, and I love going out to training camp. You go out there, you watch these players practice. They're running drills, they're running plays, they're walking through different game time scenarios. They're doing everything they can, obviously, to ready themselves for the upcoming season. Now, there are players who are expected to make the team. You have Dak Prescott, the starting quarterback, Ezekiel Elliott, the starting running back, Mari Cooper, the #1 receiver. You've got great defensive players like Leighton Vander Esch, Jalen Smith, Byron Jones. There are specific players on this team that have been around. They're obviously tremendously talented and hardworking, and they're going to make the team. But there are also many players who are not a lock to make the team. They're rookies, they're free agents, they're people who've come in from the outside, and they're getting a shot to play. So naturally, they're working very, very hard to make the team. They, hopefully at least, are going to every meeting. They're showing up early. They're staying late. They're working hard in practice. They're running through extra drills. They're always the first to volunteer to do things. And so for those no-name rookies, for those free agents, for the people who have not been around for very long, there is an expectation that they will work hard as they attempt to make this team. There are expectations in life everywhere we go. Now, if you're familiar with the idea of expectations, if you've got a few expectations in your own life, I would like you to turn with me to the book of Micah. Now, Micah is a minor prophet in the Bible, and it's probably not a book that we look at very often. But you can find Micah after the book of Jonah and before the book of Nahum in the minor prophets. So turn there and turn to chapter 6. We're going to read a collection of verses here in a few moments that are important, that we're going to look at regarding expectations. So, before we read, let's talk a little bit about the context. The people of Israel here have been disobedient. They have not lived up to the expectations of the Lord. They have done things that are sinful, they have done things that are evil, and they have done things that are against the will of God. So they are in trouble. In fact, depending on the translation of the Bible you have, it may say something different, but right at the very top of Micah chapter 6, the subtitle in my Bible, the New International Version, says this: the Lord's case against Israel. Then you look down a little later, and it says Israel's guilt and punishment. Then before chapter 7, Israel's misery. So you kind of get a feel for what's going on here. You kind of get an idea of the context surrounding this book, or at least this chapter. Israel is not doing well. They are in trouble. So Micah is talking to God here, and I want you to understand kind of what he's feeling. And so to understand what he's feeling, we're going to read Micah chapter 6, verses 6 and 7. And we're going to get kind of a clue as to what's going on here. So let's read it together, Micah 6, 6 and 7. It says this: with what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000 rivers of olive oil? Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? It's an interesting bit of text. You see, Micah's feeling something very specific, very particular. And you can see it there, and you can be clued in. There seems to be perhaps some miscommunication between Micah, the people, and God. And you can tell it there by the way Micah continually kind of escalates what he's saying here. You see, he says a few things. So let's go back to the text and see what he says. First, he says, with what shall I come before the Lord and bow down before the exalted God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Now, as I'm sure you're probably aware, the Israelites were required by the law of God to give him sacrifices. But Micah says something interesting here, something that is easy for us to miss as people who live in the 21st century, but something that would have been very contemporary for those who lived in before the first century of Israel. He says, shall I come to him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? You see, when calves were sacrificed to God, they were often much younger than a year old. In fact, if a family were to decide to sacrifice a calf that was a year old, that would have been a tremendous financial burden, probably too much to bear for most of the people living in Israel at that time. And so he says, shall I come before him with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? He's kind of trying, it seems, to make a point that the people of Israel would definitely have understood. But he doesn't stop. He actually escalates. The next thing he says is, will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams? Now, when they went to sacrifice, they were required to sacrifice one ram for specific reasons. So for Micah to say, will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, seems a bit ridiculous. Of course, the Lord did not require thousands of rams. That wasn't the expectation. Micah would have known that. The people would have known that. God obviously would have known that. But if that sounds ridiculous, he escalates it again. He continues on, and then he says, with 10,000 rivers of olive oil. Now, for certain sacrifices, olive oil was important. They would do different things with it as part of the sacrifice. Sometimes they would sacrifice the oil itself. But God obviously did not require 10,000 rivers of olive oil, as it says here in this text. And you can see the escalation continue to rise. So Micah is escalating. He clearly must not understand God's expectations here. He's gone from year-old calves to 1,000 rams to thousands of rivers of olive oil. But he doesn't end there. In fact, he escalates it one more time in a way that may seem actually quite extreme. He says there, finally at the end part of the text we've read, "Shall I offer my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul?" Now, human sacrifices were detestable to the Israelites. It is not something which they practiced. It is something that God had commanded them not to do. Although there were many surrounding nations who practiced human sacrifices, that was not the case for the people of Israel. They were not supposed to do it. That was against the law for them. Now, keep in mind that the firstborn of each family was required by God. But instead of sacrificing that firstborn, like many of the surrounding nations may have done, instead they substitute the firstborn for a different sacrifice. And that is how then that debt would be paid to God. So for them, sacrificing a human being was a terrible thing. So you can think about that. And you can see the way Micah has escalated things. He's gone from simply a year-old calf, which would have been a tremendous financial burden, but not something completely outlandish, to 1,000 rams, which would have been ridiculous, to thousands of rivers of oil, which would have been unheard of, not even thought of in that period of time, to sacrificing a firstborn, which was not only unheard of and not thought of in their case, it would have been detestable, despised, and a hated practice for the Israelites. So Micah kind of escalates this thing. But it seems as if God hears him, because God responds, God answers. So we're going to continue on. We're going to read verse 8 here. We're going to read Micah 6:8. Now, this is a text that is no doubt familiar to many of you. It's a text we have read, probably memorized at some point in our lives. It's a well-known text. So we're going to read it, and it's going to answer some questions we have about expectations. What does God expect of these people? What does he expect of us? Micah has kind of escalated the conversation here and talked about things that God clearly does not expect. So God's going to respond to that. And he says this in Micah 6:8. "He has shown you, O mortal, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you?" In other words, what does he expect? "To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God." Let me read that one more time. To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. That's it. That's all he expects. Now, that may seem to be fairly easy, and it is at least simple to say, but living up to that standard might be a little more difficult than we may think. So there are three things he said in here. Three specific and separate things God expects of us. And the first of those things is this: to act justly. So what is God saying? He's saying, be just. Act justly. Back in the year 1983, there was the National Spelling Bee, as there is many years. And at one point of the spelling bee, 85 out of the 137 contestants had been eliminated, including one, Andrew Flossdorf. Now, Flossdorf was a 13-year-old. He had been given the stage to spell the word, and he had been given the word echolalia. Now, echolalia begins with the letter E, but Andrew had spelled it and had begun it with the letter A. Somehow, the judges had missed it. Even though he'd spelled it with the letter A, therefore incorrectly spelled this word, they had either not heard it or misheard it or something had gone wrong, but they scored him as spelling the word correctly. Well, Flossdorf left the stage, realizing he'd spelled the word incorrectly after only a moment or two, and he went to speak to the judges to verify that they had made this mistake. Well, they looked at the tape, they looked at what he said, he respelled it the way he had spelled it on stage, and they came to the conclusion that he had indeed misspelled the word echolalia, and therefore he was eliminated. Now, it's hard to lose. It's hard to lose, especially if someone else makes a mistake or if someone else cuts you a break. But that is just what happened to Andrew. He lost even though someone else had inadvertently cut him a break. Someone else had made a mistake. He went and he had enough integrity to approach the judges and say, listen, as much as I would like to continue to compete in this spelling bee, I don't deserve to because I spelled this word wrong. In Andrew's words, he said that had he continued, he would have felt slimy, and that's not something he wanted to feel. How would it be in this world if many of the full-grown adults that surround us every day had as much integrity as this one 13-year-old kid? Well, that's exactly the way God commands us to be. He says, be just, act justly, for that is who we are. That is what we are supposed to be. That is expected of us as followers of Christ. Act justly. Be just. But that's not all. There are two more things. So let's look at the second thing. The second thing he says in here is be merciful. Now, I think that these things are like this in this order for a good reason. On the one hand, justice is an important thing, especially if it comes from us. If we have been given an unfair advantage, if we've been given something we don't deserve, it is on us to act justly and say, listen, although I would love for things to be this way, it's not the way they should be. Act justly. But then, sometimes, we are people in positions of power. And because we are sometimes people in positions of power, there are those who have less power than we do. And then it is on us to be merciful. And that's the second thing that he says here. Now, I ran across a story that is nothing short of incredible, actually, about former President Calvin Coolidge. Now, I did as much research as I could, and from everything I could find, this story is indeed true. So as the story goes, it was like this. Not many people realize that President Calvin Coolidge did not always live in the White House. As vice president, he became president upon the death of Warren G. Harding. Mrs. Harding continued to live in the White House for a time. So the Coolidges remained where they had been living in the third-floor suite of the nearby Willard Hotel. Once in the middle of the night, the new president awoke to see an intruder going through his clothes. He watched as the thief first removed a wallet, then unhooked a watch chain, and Coolidge calmly spoke up from the darkness. About that watch, I wish you wouldn't take that. The startled man, gaining his voice, asked, why? Coolidge answered, I don't mean the watch and the chain, only the charm. I'm very fond of that charm. It means a great deal to me. Take it near the window and read what is engraved on the back of it. The burglar read, presented to Calvin Coolidge, Speaker of the House by the Massachusetts General Court. And now he was even more surprised. Are you President Coolidge? He asked. He evidently did not think he'd find the president sleeping in a hotel. Yes, I am. And I don't want you to take that charm, he said. Then he asked, why, son, why are you doing this? The young man explained that he and a friend had traveled to Washington during their college break. They spent all of their money and had no money to pay the hotel bill or pay for the train passage back to school. "If you don't mind," he said, "I'll just take the wallet." Coolidge did mind. He knew he had about $80 in his wallet, so he said, "How much will it take to pay your hotel bill and get you and your friend back to campus? Sit down. Let's talk this over." Coolidge added up the room rate and the 2 rail tickets, and it came to $32. This may not sound like much to you and me now, but it was a considerably larger sum of money then. "I'll give you the $32 as a loan," the president said, "and I expect you to pay me back." The youth thanked him. Coolidge then advised him to leave by the same window he used to enter the room, as Secret Service agents were sure to be patrolling the hallway. As the young man climbed out, Coolidge left him with this admonition: "Son, you're a nice boy. You are better than you're acting. You are starting down the wrong road. Just remember who you are." It wasn't until the death of Mrs. Coolidge in 1957 that this story was allowed to come out, and it was first published in the Los Angeles Times. And most interesting of all is that the president's notes showed that the young man was indeed better than he was acting. He repaid the $32 loan in full. God says, be merciful. There are people who we will come across in life who are going to make mistakes, who are going to take advantage of us, whether purposefully or on accident. There are people who are going to do things that they shouldn't do, say things they shouldn't say, think things they shouldn't think. But God says, be merciful. Think about the times we have done things we shouldn't do, said things we shouldn't have said, think things we should not have thought. And during those times, we want mercy. We want people to look at us and say, listen, it's all right. You're forgiven. We'll do better next time. And here, President Coolidge had an opportunity to be merciful, and that's exactly what he did. He could have gotten up, simply opened the door to the hallway and said to the Secret Service, "This young man is stealing from me. Arrest him." And they would have done exactly that. And although to Coolidge, that may have been the easy option and something that would have kept him awake maybe for a few minutes, then he would have returned to sleep once the young man had been taken away, he instead did something much more difficult. And at the end of the day, even though it only cost him a little bit of time, it appears that it made a lifetime of difference in the life of this young man. He was merciful. And God says, be merciful. So he said 2 things thus far. Be just, be merciful. But then we move to the third and final thing. And it says this, be humble. So once you've acted justly, once you've acted mercifully, then it's also important to act humbly. Because what's the point of being just and being merciful if you're arrogant about it? It may not make that much of a difference after all. The story is told of Booker T. Washington shortly after he became head of the Tuskegee Institute in Alabama. He was walking past the house of a wealthy family. The woman of the house, assuming Washington was one of the yard workers her husband had hired, asked him if he would chop some wood for her. Professor Washington smiled, nodded, took off his coat, and chopped the wood. When he carried the armload of wood into the woman's kitchen, a servant girl recognized him and rushed to her mistress to tell her of his identity. The next morning, the woman appeared in Washington's office. Apologizing profusely, she said repeatedly, "I did not know it was you I put to work." Washington replied with grace and generosity, "It's entirely all right, madam. I like to work and I'm delighted to do favors for my friends and neighbors." The woman was so taken with his manner and his willingness to forgive that she gave generous gifts to the Institute and persuaded many of her wealthy acquaintances to do likewise. In the end, Washington raised as much money for the Institute from one act of chopping wood as he did from any other fundraising event. A great leader is never beyond hard work. True willingness to serve others is the essence of true leadership. Walk humbly. Booker T. Washington did something that he wasn't required to do, he would have been fully within his own right to look at that woman and say, I'm sorry, I don't work here. I am not probably who you think I am. But instead, when he was asked to complete a task that was not his responsibility, he did just that. He went out back, got a sharpened axe, chopped the wood, and took it inside. God says, walk humbly. Walking humbly isn't always the easiest thing to do. Walking humbly will sometimes require us to do things that feel uncomfortable, that don't feel right, that feel like, ugh, I don't like that feeling. That is hard. That is difficult. But that's precisely what we are called to do and precisely who we are called to be. So I guess we circle back around to expectations. What does God expect of you and I? Well, it's simple, really. God does not expect year-old calves, 1,000 rams, thousands of rivers of oil, or our firstborn children. None of those things are part of the expectations of God. He has not required us to give those things, nor should we. But what he does expect is something much more important, and he answers it here. He expects 3 things of us, according to Micah. He expects us to be just, he expects us to be merciful, and he expects us to be humble. And it's important that we do those things. Why should we be just? Well, we should be just because life is unfair sometimes. And we should do everything we can within our own spheres to make things just and make things fair for the people surrounding us. We will get, on occasion, unfair advantages. And it's up to you and me to spread the wealth around a little bit, to give justice to others. Then he expects us to be merciful. We will run into people from time to time who take advantage of us, who do things wrong by us, who do things, say things, think things they should not. And we are called then to be merciful, to extend them some forgiveness, to give them something they do not deserve. And then finally, we are called to be humble, to walk in the light of God, not to flaunt our own wealth or abilities, but instead to be humble and act with humility. Because that's what Jesus would do, and therefore, that's what we should do as followers of his, as followers of Christ. Thank you so much for joining us today on Creating Disciples. We hope this message was a blessing to you, and we hope God is with you. Thank you.